Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ross Melzer, EU Affairs Director at Euractiv, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Euractiv debate towards a mandatory EU system of due diligence for supply chains, realities and consequences. Our event today is supported by VDMA. They are the association representing the German mechanical engineering industry. I'd like to introduce you to Teresa Dominguez. Teresa will be moderating the audience Q&A today. Welcome to you, Teresa.
Good afternoon and welcome. When writing questions in the Q&A section, which you can find at the bottom of the chat box on the right side of your screen, please be sure to identify yourself, keep your questions short and concise, and indicate to which panelist you are addressing the question. We also encourage tweeting. So join the online discussion on Twitter using the hashtag EADebates. Hashtag EADebates. Enjoy the discussion.
Thank you, Teresa. So, an EU system of due diligence for supply chains. To kick things off, I'm going to give a brief overview to bring everyone up to date. At the end of January, the European Parliament's Legal Committee adopted a report calling on the European Union to legally require companies to protect human rights and the environment in their supply chains. The move is intended to increase EU scrutiny of companies over the impact their operations have on the environment and people globally, not just in the 27-country bloc. The report urged the European Commission to propose mandatory due diligence requirements on environmental and human rights risks for all companies and sectors established in the bloc, and this would also include state-owned undertakings and the financial sector. The Parliament will vote on the proposal tomorrow after yesterday's debate in plenary. It aims to shape legislation on sustainable corporate governance, which the Commission will then propose in the second quarter of this year. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about an EU law that will require companies to monitor, identify, prevent, and remedy risks to human rights, the environment, and governance in their operations and business relationships. And most importantly, this will include their suppliers and subcontractors. The report proposes that when risks arise, a company should make the details public, along with measures to address it. National authorities will check that companies enforce the rules and could impose penalties after having investigated complaints. The proposal would give victims of human rights violations the right to take EU companies to court. Now, some of the issues that we'll be discussing today is whether companies, and I do mean companies of all sizes, can actually influence actions and behaviours of third parties. Whether the international codes of conduct many companies already have for supplier contracts are sufficient or not. And what impact might this new legislation have on European companies? To discuss all these issues this afternoon, we are joined by Lucrezia Busa, who is member of Commissioner Redner's cabinet at the European Commission, Lara Walters, Dutch S&D member of the European Parliament. Lara is a member of the Jury Committee and of course worked as rapporteur on the report to the Commission. Winand Quaid-Vliek, who is Vice President of the Employers Group at the European Economic and Social Committee. Tim Gore, Head of Low Carbon and Circular Economy Programme at the Institute for European Environmental Policy. Ben van Pepperstrate, who is Business and Human Rights Expert at European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights. And last but not least, Bertram Kavlat, who is Vice President of VDMA, and Bertram is also a small business owner himself. Welcome to you all. I've asked each of the panelists to kick off with a very short introduction. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to Lara, who led the debate in Parliament yesterday. Lara, in 60 seconds, why do you think this legislation is so important?
I think this legislation is important because we still see far too many headlines in the newspapers of things going wrong when businesses have value chains that are expansive, when businesses do business around the world. And I think that we need to address those. And so you can think of examples like Rana Plaza, like the oil spills in Nigeria, or now the workers in Qatar that have died. I hope you can still see me, by the way, that have died in preparation for the World Cup. So we need to do something about that. And for that, it is important that we go from voluntary standards that currently exist to mandatory standards. And I think that in that way, we as Europe can take our responsibility and can leverage our 450 plus million consumers.
Thank you, Lara. Very succinct. Lucrezia, in 60 seconds, what's the Commission's main thinking behind this proposed legislation?
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, as the Commissioner said yesterday in the debate in plenary, where you welcomed the report by MEP Wolters, whom I'd like to thank and congratulate once more for that. The Commission is working on an initiative that will include, on the one hand, a mandatory due diligence duty, and on the other hand, a clarification on directors' duty of care to clarify that directors in their duty of care should look at the long-term interests of the company and take into account also the impact of the company's activities on the stakeholders, such as the workers, the customers, and other stakeholders around that. And the commissioners will look, therefore, at risks that may arise from the company's activities and may concern harm to the environment, human rights, and also labor rights. And why this is important? It's important because we want to foster, not only within the union, but also outside of the union, behaviors by companies that would contribute to, would enable the union to fulfill fully its commitment when it comes to the environment, respect for the environment, like the Paris Agreement, but also when it comes to human rights and labor rights. It's about making sure that we respect both inside and within the union the same commitments and the same values.
I know we'll come back to many of the points that you've just raised there. Winant, what's the general view from the employer's perspective?
I think the first thing is that it is a very important subject and one of the most important legislative exercises taking place actually. It builds on the UN guiding principles and on the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which were established in 2011. And since that time, a kind of cultural revolution in companies has taken place, and many developments also have taken place in the field of due diligence. But more can and more should be done. The end result, however, must be workable for business, and that is where we have a big concern, because we are convinced that the Parliament's proposal is simply not workable for business. Basically for 4 reasons: unclear definitions, catch-all approach of value chain, suppliers and stakeholders, open and vague norms, and draconic sanctions. Basically, companies are made responsible for everything. Of course, we have to keep in mind that there are 3 positions now. There is the Parliament, there is the Council, and there is the Commission, and a lot of discussion will take place. We hope that in the end, a constructive and workable solution can be found for business, but a very serious impact assessment is needed before any legislation is established, especially because business is very much weakened after the crisis, and we have to carefully reflect before burdening it with extra administrative charges. Thank you.
Thank you, Winant. Tim, how is this legislation going to help the EU's environmental ambitions?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for the invitation and greetings to all of the fellow panelists. I think the important thing to remember here is that a large part of the EU's environmental impacts take place outside of the EU's borders. We know, for example, that between a quarter and a half, according to the European Environment Agency, of our impacts take place beyond the EU. If everyone in the world consumed like Europeans, we'd need around 3 planets to sustain us all. So it's really vital to address the impacts beyond our borders in our supply chains. If we just look at deforestation, we know that the EU is one of the world's biggest importers of forest risk products. It's probably the highest per capita importer of those products. Its imports are responsible for a large share of global deforestation around the world, for example. So this legislation is critical to addressing those impacts beyond our own borders. But I think it's also very important to say that to address both the environment and the human rights impacts in a coherent horizontal package, because often these are environmental and human rights impacts are 2 sides of the same coin. And it's vital that if we want to build a just and a sustainable economy in Europe, that we address those 2 types of impacts together.
Thank you, Tim. And Ben, your 60 seconds, what impact is this legislation going to have on human rights, do you think?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting us and for assembling such a great panel. For us, the purpose of this legislation is first and foremost to prevent human rights abuses and impacts and environmental impacts and government impacts. So the whole purpose is to change the way that businesses operate so that those impacts are prevented. And for those remaining impacts, it is indeed important that victims can actually seek remedy for those impacts that actually occurred. So in that sense, it's also important that any legislation is accompanied by a strong enforcement mechanism, including a liability mechanism. But the purpose is to prevent, to avoid impact. That's what we all want in the end.
Okay, thank you, Ben. And finally, Bertram, how does industry, or more specifically a small company like your own, see this legislation?
It depends on what we make of it. And thank you for the opportunity today. I'm the living example of a subject of this legislation, running a company of less than 400 employees, exporting 75% of the turnover in 93 countries, purchasing goods from 17 countries, 460 different suppliers, and 8,000 different components that we purchase all over the world. So we're a typical SME, exporting SME. For this, I'm a typical member of the mechanical engineering industry, and speaking also as a president of the Association of the Mechanical Engineering Industry, the VDMA, I speak for many, many companies like mine. And let me please state, we fully support as VDMA the objective of the legislation. We want to protect human rights. We want to stop child labor and other abuse. And we also, and especially myself as a passionate European, we believe that a European legislation is much better than a patchwork of national regulations. But please let us take account of the limitations and the limited abilities of an SME company. So let's discuss about how can we make this legislation SME friendly. So as said before, an SME, we need to have a better definition of human rights because we are too small to check the biodiversity, the Paris Climate Treaty, and so on. So definition is a problem for me. I would like to have SMEs and not capital market oriented companies to be excluded. If this is not possible, please limit the definitions of what we have to do in the underlying due diligence or the depth. So also I would like to avoid civil liability, and I would like to have the responsibility of the governments as well. So please help us in a whitelisting of countries where we can work. So SME friendliness with my 6 persons in procurement.
Okay. Thank you, Bertram. Listening to these opening statements, there seems to be very little doubt about the noble political objective behind this upcoming legislation. None of us want to see those pictures of burnt down textile factories or child labor on coffee plantations. But I do put it to the policymakers, to Lucrezia and Lara, and this is a question that has been asked by industry, as we've just heard from Bertram. Have you got the balance right? In other words, in achieving this important political objective, can we be sure that business models of some companies, notably SMEs, will not be negatively impacted? Lara, your thoughts, please.
The thought that just went through my mind was I'm not a sorcerer, and I would struggle to understand why the EPP would be so supportive of this deal if we had gotten it so wrong in terms of that balance. And the things that were mentioned by Wienand in his opening statement, I would like to respond to briefly, because I think that they were a little bit of a caricature. I think that in terms of the vague norms that we would have, those vague norms are there because what we want from companies is proactiveness, and what we don't want to do is to be overly subscriptive. So of course you need to find a balance there, but businesses have also told us we will be burdened by overly prescriptive, overly micromanaged rules for us because we know our supply chains, we know our sectors best. The same, I think, when it comes to the different definitions, what we have done is we have said, okay, we understand that there is a special need for SMEs, but SMEs have not come as a group to me and said, look, we need to be exempt from this. What they have told me is we need measures that are tailored, we need measures that are proportionate, but if we were to be exempt, then that would actually create problems for us further down the line, because more and more, also in terms of bank financing, we need to prove what we are doing. That is not the only reason that we have included them here, but that is one of the reasons. So what we have done for SMEs is we have said, look, SMEs that do face risks in their value chains need to be included. SMEs that are listed need to be included. But even then, those SMEs, if they are convinced that they face no risks whatsoever, they can issue a statement that essentially exempts them from this, where they essentially explain why this shouldn't be applying to them, and then they can leave it there. So I really struggle to see how we wouldn't have gotten that balance right. I think we have gone all in for proportionality, for making sure that businesses can have the right amount of discretion in the steps they undertake. We ask them to be we ask them to prioritize, so to look at the risks most salient to them. But at the same time, what we've done here, which hasn't been mentioned yet, is we are asking them we're introducing here an obligation of means rather than result. And what that means is we're asking for their best efforts. We're asking them to do what can reasonably be expected of them. We are not asking them to manage the very last square millimeters of their supply chains. So again, I really struggle to see how we would have gotten the balance so wrong.
Thank you, Lara, and I will obviously let the other panelists respond to that, and Wienand come back to you. But before I do, I'd like to hear from the other policymaker on the panel, Lucrezia. The balance, is it right?
On our side, we are still working on the initiative. So what I can say is that we are aiming to have the good balance, and we are doing our best to get it right, and I'm sure we will get it right at the end. So we can speak. I'm happy to speak again and answer these questions. Once also the Commission proposal has been completed in some months. On what I can say already, though, is that we are working, as I was saying, to strike the good balance, and this means, on the one hand, to have an initiative that achieves the objectives that I mentioned before, that it is effective when it comes also to the enforcement mechanism, but on the other hand, it is also balanced when it comes to the impact that it has on the various European companies and on the European economy as such. When we speak about SMEs, this will translate in particular to attention that is given to SMEs in terms of looking at also at the risks that these SMEs can face, and their risk profile, and then also making the political choices based also on risk profile. It's due diligence, as we know, is a risk-based assessment. It enables companies to control and mitigate the risks based on their best processes and best efforts to put in place such processes. And it is in this framework, it is normal that companies that present a higher risk will be treated differently from those that do not present any risk. And in this case, the same. I think also from what MEP Wolters was explaining before me, that the current Parliament proposal goes in the same direction. It has a risk-based approach. When it comes also to the SMEs, we are also striving to achieve the right balance also when defining and targeting the possible provisions and the possible obligations that they would have to meet. And on the other hand, there is also thinking about how to support them for this transition through possible guidance, administrative support as well, help desks, but also through a possible funding that would enable them to meet the objectives of this initiative. As I was saying at the beginning, the way we look at it is in a comprehensive way. It's an initiative that should enable the union as such, the private sector and the public sector to achieve our goals and to be sure that we respect our fundamental rights and values.
Thank you, Lucrezia. Winand, let me come back to you now, because in your opening statement, you spoke about unclear definitions. You talked about a catch-all approach. Now, we've just heard from Lara and Lucrezia that they firmly believe there is good proportionality in this legislation. Lara spoke about exemptions, and both Lara and Lucrezia mentioned that this is about best practices, best efforts, rather than actual results. So, Winand, what's your response to what you've just heard?
Yeah, well, I would be most happy if the presentation I gave was just a caricature, as Lara said, but I'm afraid it is not. And the reason is that indeed there is clearly a lot of goodwill in the proposal to make it proportionate and to make it reasonable. The point is that the norms that are in this proposal are mostly taken over from the OECD guidelines, where they are voluntary norms. So there is a lot of discretionary room, there is a lot of openness. But here we are talking about mandatory norms. Suddenly they are mandatory. And they can be, you can have a legal liability based on these norms. But these open, vague norms are not usable for this purpose. There is legal uncertainty because there are no criteria to interpret the open norms. There is the idea that the Commission would come forward with guidelines. That is one step of uncertainty of interpretation. They should be implemented in national law. They should be interpreted by national judges. They should be interpreted by national competent authorities. So there is legal uncertainty all around. At the same time, the norms are very, very deep. On the supply chain, for example, you basically are responsible for everything to the latest plastic or leather or metal detail that is used somewhere in a complicated product. And there is a very wide room for stakeholders to go to court against companies. And these stakeholder, the rights for stakeholders are also interpreted in a very broad way. And so you are confronted with a vague norm. You don't know how the judge will interpret. You know that stakeholders can be very aggressive in suing you, and you don't know what to do as a company. So it is the fact that the voluntary norms, which leave room for interpretation, suddenly becomes mandatory, can be interpreted by judges. You don't know in which direction, and there are draconic sanctions, which creates this extreme uncertainty and problems for companies.
Thank you, Win. And we'll come back to this question of liability a bit later in the debate. Bertrand, I'm going to bring you in a second to give a reaction to what has been said. But before I do, I'd like to hear from both Tim and Ben on their view about whether this legislation is fair and balanced and should be applied to all companies. Tim, if you go first, please.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think, the first thing to remember here is that something's got to change about our economy and our business models of all companies, because we all started by saying there are endemic human rights violations in supply chains all around the world, in products that we all buy and consume here in Europe. And there is widespread ecological devastation around the world as well. We're in a moment of ecological crisis. So something's got to change. We can't actually just carry on as with business as usual. And I think it's also fair to say that all companies will struggle. This isn't a light undertaking. We're not asking or expecting companies to just have a new box ticking exercise. I think even the largest companies in Europe have got to take some to change the way that they do business in order to comply with this proposed legislation. It's not straightforward, and it won't be straightforward even for the biggest companies. But that said, it doesn't mean that complying with this legislation is the end of the world, or that it will ruin the economy. I mean, quite the contrary. I think that what we're expecting with this type of due diligence approach is that companies get to know their supply chains. They are more transparent about their supply chains. They think about the risks in those supply chains, and then they prioritize. I understand very well the problems that small and medium-sized enterprises might face, but I mean, think also about some of the biggest companies, supermarkets. It's one of the sectors that I've done some work on due diligence with. They've got thousands and thousands of supply chains all around the world. Of course, that's a daunting prospect. Think, how on earth can we go about understanding the risks in all of those different supply chains? But there are processes, there are tools for prioritizing, for boiling it down, for making it workable, for getting started. And that would be just the same for SMEs. And I would say that if you leave SMEs out of this approach, the risk is actually that you leave them behind in the transition to a new type of economy. We know that citizens around Europe want to have more traceability. They want to have more knowledge about where their products are coming from. They want to know that their products are not causing deforestation, that they're not linked to human rights violations. And increasingly, you're going to have companies that are complying with this due diligence approach that are able to make those claims with some basis, some grounding. And SMEs are going to need to be able to do that as well to compete. And I'd say, if anything, that's an area in which some SMEs may have some advantage.
Thanks, Tim. Ben, fair and balanced, what are your thoughts?
I think that at least the proposal that is debated in the Parliament, as Lara also said, if you see the debates that happened yesterday, there was a broad cross-party political support. So it means that everybody, ranging from the center-right to the radical left, I think it's, identifies with this way forward. And that way forward is indeed risk-based, as both Lara and Lucrezia have emphasized. So you look at the severity of the risk and then look at what are the measures that are appropriate to the severity of the risk. So that means that obviously whether this impacts SMEs, I don't think is the right question, because let's say the baker around my corner or the bar in Hungary will not necessarily have the same severity of risks in its operations and supply chains as, let's say, the diamond trader in Antwerp, which is still a small outfit when you look at the number of people working there, but might have much more significant risks in its supply chain or downstream. So you need to look at each company in its own specific context and in its own specific risk profile. So in that sense, going from risk-based norms that are flexible makes a lot of sense. I think what's also important to emphasize, and I think Winant already referenced that, is that a lot of the think work on how this could and should work has already been done. The UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines were respectively agreed and updated in 2011. So we had a decade of companies, and especially forward-looking companies, already integrating this thinking in the way that their business is working, making maybe some amendments to some of their business decisions and their business models in order to better align with the guiding principles and the norms. And what we now see is that actually quite some individual companies are saying, we need a legislation and we actually need a liability mechanism because we currently are at the limit. Go all the way, we need a stronger floor to stand on. And so we do want to assure that our direct competitors have the same obligations. So in that sense, obviously, a law with an enforcement mechanism, a sanction mechanism is important, not necessarily to go sanctioning everybody, but to make sure that that laggard 5% also gets aboard with this whole transformation in the way that we are doing business.
Thank you, Ben. Bertram, we've heard from several of the speakers that a lot of thought has gone into this when it comes to the impact on SMEs. So I do want to hear your reaction to this. And I'd also be interested to hear if you think there's an argument for different rules for different companies. For example, should SMEs be asked to verify only their first-tier suppliers as opposed to all of their suppliers? So, Bertram, back to you.
Thank you. I hear the words, but I do not find those words back in the legislation proposal. And I keep being reminded to the Charlie Chaplin movie, The Great Dictator, when there's a misfire in that large cannon, and the general says to the next man next to him, go defuse the bomb. And he turns to the next person next to him and says, now you defuse the bomb. In the end, it's small, poor Charlie Chaplin who has to go and put his fingers on the bomb. My company will be the one who has to put their fingers on the issue. And there is prosecution looming, personal prosecution. And then again, Lara, I don't find your words that the means is more important than the result. I will be prosecuted according to the legislation proposal, according to results, not if I had nice means. And when you say not the last millimeters of the supply chain should be checked, this is also not in the proposal because there's no limitation to the tier 1 suppliers, for example. And no, we are not the bakery. But we are also not the t-shirt. Engineering is employing more than 3 million employees in well-paid jobs in Europe alone. And we have well-paid jobs all over the world in our international value chains. And again, we recognize human rights. And very often we have our own code of conducts already. We have implementation of human rights in our contracts. But that is not going with looming prosecution. And you should think how it should work for me. With my own company, we have 6 persons working in procurement. We have 460 suppliers in 17 countries, 6 persons. Can you imagine how many times we are able to really visit the companies we purchase from? And please don't tell me that the new legislation will make me to get to know my suppliers or my supply chain. I think we know our supply chain quite well, but we have limits on what we can check if we're there. 460 suppliers. It takes, with traveling time, 2 to 3 years to visit every single supplier once a year, at least once a year. We might see everything nice, and we will set up the the due diligence systems, but we have no influence. What happens in the 2.5 years between that? So no, I would like that the European Union takes over their share of the responsibility, like helping us with the whitelist, because I cannot, with my company, decide whether, for example, is China a country which is okay? Is only a certain region of China okay because of the Uyghurs, or is a country where we have capital punishment okay or not okay? How do we deal with the United States? How do we deal with China? Help me with definitions. Show me
Bertram,
what I have to prove.
I think, thank you, that's, your point is well made, and I'd like to give Lara and Lucrezia the opportunity to respond to that. And your point is really about the practicality of this. You know, we're talking about export-driven companies, and the model of an export-driven company is largely based on diversity of suppliers. And as you say, it's not unusual for these companies to have several hundred suppliers in different parts of the world, and it's just not possible for the CEO or anybody else to visit them all in a year, let alone in 3 years, let alone 1 year. So, Lucrezia, Lara, the practicality of this, what's your response, please? Lara.
Apologies, that was bound to happen. Gosh, that was a whole range of things that were mentioned there. So I'm not sure I can get through all of them. But maybe to start with a bit of a visual example, as the previous speaker gave when mentioning Charlie Chaplin. What I think about when I hear his remarks there, I think about that great cartoon of the New Yorker, where there's some children and a businessman in a ripped suit sitting around a campfire, and the businessman is telling them something along the lines of, yes, we destroyed the planet, but for a beautiful moment in time, we maximized shareholder value, you know. And I think that that is, for me, something that we need to remember throughout, and that I think Tim started his remarks with if there is no agreement, if there is no intent for anything to change, then I would say to the previous speaker, you know, all of what he says should be taken on board. But the issue here is we do need things to change. We cannot go and continue, you know, with business as usual, because companies have a big role to play in us achieving the goals of the Green Deal, in us making sure that the planet doesn't warm up until temperatures we can no longer control, and so forth. And therefore, yes, we are not going to introduce something that has no teeth whatsoever and that doesn't change anything. That said, I think that all of the allegations, you know, I think that they are a bit of a caricature. The text absolutely speaks of an obligation of means rather than results. That's clear. We talk about member states ensuring liability for where companies are directly linked to or where they have caused harm. I don't think that is an odd thing to do, because that is exactly the purpose of what we're doing here, that now through making this mandatory that there are consequences to causing harm. We don't talk about personal prosecution yet, so I'm not entirely sure where he gets that, although of course in a future proposal we might also see provisions on directors' duties. But I just don't see how all of what he said can be taken into account, and then for there to still be a change for the better. And that is why we have tried to find a balance in which, of course, we make these measures proportional. We make sure that for SMEs there is special support. We talk about them separately also. And as was mentioned before too, I mean, for SMEs, the irony is that, of course, often they will know their supply chains that much better than multinationals, because the supply chains might be less complex. They have often said to me that they don't want a shadow regime that then makes it harder for them if and when they do want to grow. They don't want there to be a chilling effect within the supply chains of bigger companies that then say, well, those SMEs are a black box and I'm going to cut them out. I think all of those are very good reasons to include them in a proportional manner. But cutting them out altogether, I think, is a manifesto for no change at all.
Lucrezia, thank you, Lara. Lucrezia, I'd like you also to comment in a moment on the practicality, the points that were brought up by Bertram and Winand. But also, I've heard in the last few comments talk about the implementation. Now, we know that national authorities will check if companies are enforcing these rules. They'd investigate complaints and possibly impose penalties. How can policymakers ensure that the new rules are going to be implemented uniformly across all member states, avoiding any possible national solo efforts? And I'll give you an example. Take Germany. SMEs, we know, are the backbone of the German economy. Germany is an export-led nation. Do you worry that enforcement may not be as strict in a country like Germany as in some other member states?
No, not more than, as you know, for the Commission, it's normal to adopt legislation at European level that, especially in cases where the legislation adopted is a directive, then it's the provisions that are adopted at European level need to be then implemented, transposed, and further implemented at the national level, and there are enforcement by the various national authorities. So this is not something something new that we would do here. We call on national authorities to enforce this legislation. What is important, though, is that the legislation sets out a clear framework, that it gives the clear guidance to the national authorities on what they have to do, which is the enforcement mechanism that we are thinking of. And I think the Commissioner has already explained a couple of times that we are thinking about an administrative enforcement mechanism and a civil enforcement mechanism, civil liability enforcement mechanism. And we will also see how to combine eventually the two. And then when presenting this, it is also equally important to explain also clearly in the legislations what could be the remedies that the national authorities could impose, and also what also the obligations for the companies should be clearly spelled out, so that the companies have legal certainty and they know what the risks are that they are facing. In this way, we think that there will be there is the possibility to create a legal framework that will ensure that the legislation is applied in a way that creates a level playing field across the Union, and that is, in fact, creating a level playing field across the Union is also one of the main purposes of this proposal. And when we think about it, thinking about it and we think about the current context, we should also bear in mind that there is already legislation in some countries, in a few European countries. There are discussions in other European countries to adopt a similar legislation. So in the absence of a regulatory intervention from the Union, there will be indeed different regimes with which the European companies will have to comply with. And the value added of a Union intervention is exactly to make sure that there is a level playing field and one system that would be applied across the Union.
Yeah. Thank you, Lucrezia. I hear from Teresa that the Q&A is going wild, so we're going to go across to her and take our first set of audience questions. Teresa.
Thank you, Ross. Indeed. So our first question is for Lara from Minju Seo. Asks if you could elaborate on the specifics regarding exemptions for SMEs.
Yeah. Exemptions for SMEs. For clarity, I also include micro enterprises. So in principle, we said micro enterprises, fine to have those excluded. For SMEs, what we've said is those that face risks in their value chain. So think of risk sectors like the garment industry, conflict minerals, and so forth. Those should be included, but included in a proportionate way. And also SMEs that are listed on stock exchanges should be included. Now, aside from the fact that we have said measures should be commensurate, measures should be proportionate to the size, what we have also said, of course, is that this is that there is the opportunity or the possibility for companies, and this includes large ones actually, that really believe that there are no risks in their supply chains and that they ought not to be affected by this, that they can publish a statement to that effect that essentially is a comply or explain statement. Not entirely the same, but in that sort of spirit. So those are, in a nutshell, what we have foreseen for SMEs.
Thank you very much, Lara, for the clarification indeed. I have now a question for Lucrezia from VJHLB. Asks, what would be the consequence of non-compliance? Who decides and how?
As I was saying, we are looking, first of all, we are still analyzing what the various provisions of our future proposal. As I was saying, the main directions we are thinking of are administrative, is an administrative enforcement system that would include some sanctions, penalties probably, and that would be applied at national level by the national authorities, and then there would be a civil liability regime, for which the normal civil enforcement mechanism would apply, involving a judge, etc. What we are thinking of is still the conditions to be, the questions that we are still thinking of are who would be legitimate to bring such an action and under what conditions.
Thank you very much. We have a very popular question in the Q&A that I will direct to Lara. Why are specific due diligence requirements put forward when horizontal legislation is prepared? Is there a risk for duplication or overlap?
Could you repeat the question? Is the question, why are we doing this at the same time as some individual member state initiatives?
Exactly, yes.
We are doing this to avoid worse, I think, in terms of fragmentation. The reason that we're doing this is to avoid harm to the environment and to people. But the reason that this is also being done now is to make sure that we don't end up with the European Union in which 27 different legal regimes apply, and companies need to know each and every single one in order to do business on the internal market. So we're doing this to avoid fragmentation, to make sure that businesses know what is expected of them, to give them legal clarity, and to make sure that those different legislative initiatives, but also the voluntary standards that are there, and also the certification mechanisms and other voluntary systems that are out there, like eco labels and so forth, that all of that isn't the sort of jungle that it is now for businesses, but that there's one clear regime in the EU.
Thank you, Lara. We'll come back to the audience Q&A a bit later, but I did want to drill down on this question of liability, which has been brought up in recent comments. Bertrand, you were quite clear that you believe that there is some sort of personal liability. Lara, you have indicated that is not necessarily the case. Now, I'm not sure we'll find a solution to that in today's debate, but Tim and Ben, I would like to ask you both, how far do you think, as civil society, this should go? Do you envisage CEOs being prosecuted? Do you think there should be personal liability? Tim, please.
Well, in a word, yes. In that company owners should be responsible for the impacts of their company's business operations. That said, and that includes, of course, in their supply chains. I mean, that said, I don't think anybody envisages a raft of lawsuits, as a result of this legislation. What is important is that there is a mechanism for individuals that have been affected by adversely affected in terms of their human rights, which often will be connected with environmental harms as well, because these are often, very closely connected, that those individuals or communities have some course for redress, for remedy, and that can be taken forwards. Now, I think that the way that the proposed legislation sets it out, the bar is quite high, nonetheless, for establishing that a company in Europe or a company that's operating in the European market has contributed to or directly caused that adverse impact. So it's not like this is going to be a free-for-all where we're going to see cases brought left, right, and centre. That's quite a high bar, but it means that in principle there is recourse for communities or individuals that have been adversely impacted to seek some measure of redress, and ultimately that may mean that company owners, CEOs should be held accountable. But I think it does strike me that this has been set out in a way which is reasonable and is proportional, and I don't think that any civil society actor which is looking at this is going to start thinking about SMEs in the first instance as well. Let's start going after the SMEs. I mean, there are bigger fish to fry, frankly. This is going to be about looking at the absolutely most egregious adverse impacts in the first instance, and taking those on. And this isn't going to be something that overnight you're going to see SME CEOs suddenly hauled up in court. I just don't think that's I think that's a complete red herring, frankly. It's just a straw man, and we just need to be careful. But let's be honest about the kind of legal redress that this would lead to.
Okay, thanks for that, Tim. Ben, obviously any good legislation in the implementation process, it must have teeth. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, first of all, I do want to reiterate that prevention is always better than the cure. That also applies here. But if you then look at the enforcement strategy that the Commission is proposing, it makes a lot of sense. So on the one hand, indeed, an administrative oversight, which in the proposal by the Parliament is relatively boilerplate in the way it's formulated. We've seen in plenty of other similar instruments, similar competent authorities being mandated with investigative powers, ex officio or on the basis of a complaint, and also if they find a problem to propose corrective actions, and if necessary to propose sanctions. So I do want to dispel that this is an extraordinary, egregious regime on that level. And the same thing, it does want to also organize civil liability at the union level, which I think makes sense. I think it's the whole venture of the Commission taking the driving seat and establishing rules across the union that need to be uniformly interpreted by national judges, but those are also union judges. That's how the union enforcement system works. Makes a lot of sense. So in those egregious cases where there is actually harm that occurred that could have been prevented through exercising due diligence, it is logical that those victims have a way to seize a judge and ask for compensatory or reparatory or other compensation in front of that judge. So for us, it seems actually quite a logical approach. I don't think that in at least the due diligence obligation, which remains a corporate obligation, given also the administrative and civil nature, that this will result in mass prosecution against CEOs in their individual capacity, as was, I think, suggested by Bertram. That's not what this legislation, or at least the signals that we hear from Mr. Reinders, as well as what we read from Parliament, is actually underpinning.
Okay, thanks, Ben. We've got a couple more excellent questions for Lara in particular, but before we go to those, Winand, I'd like to bring you back in. What you've just heard about liability and so on, are you reassured by that?
I'm afraid not, no. But maybe before answering, I'm very critical, but that is because I want to be constructive. It must be a good proposal in the end. it is not so that we think that nothing should change. There should certainly change a lot, and it should not be business as usual. A lot of thinking going on in business, a lot of changes have occurred, and a lot of businesses are indeed thinking how to go further, how to move further. We don't want a box-ticking exercise. The problem with the reasonings of Lara and Ben and Tom is, in my view, that they are strongly political reasonings. And that's also true, I think, for the majority in Parliament. But we are talking here about mandatory legislation. And that means that we need a legal to work, yes or no. And I think the reasonings are concentrated on a voluntary approach, not on a mandatory approach. If in a voluntary approach, if you have a good story why you prioritized certain things and didn't do other things, then that will be enough. But in a mandatory regime, take for example a big company with 80,000 suppliers. They can't change everything at the same time. So, for example, they decide to concentrate on human rights issues, and they do a lot there. But then there is a stakeholder who says, well, my interest is not human rights, my interest is environment or climate. And you haven't done anything there, and you have a mandatory obligation to do something. If that stakeholder goes to court, then the judge will say, yeah, you're right. There was a mandatory obligation to do something on climate. The company didn't do so, and that is why it is liable. So that's the problem. We are reasoning on voluntary approaches, but this is a mandatory system. It's totally different.
Thank you, Winnen. Lara, you will get the chance to respond to that in a second, but I know that Bertram is itching to come back in with a reaction. Bertram.
Thank you very much. I want this change as well, to make that very, very clear. And so are all of our members. And we would like to bring our part and our efforts in there. So this should be clear. And also, I'm not afraid of liability for my own actings, but I would like to be liability for things I can really control. So there is a view till the horizon, which I can see even in my supply chain, and there are some things which are beyond the horizon. So like the tier one, if I purchase chips in China, I can see the chip factory. I can visit them. I can make my contract in. I do not have real access that would be beyond the horizon. Where do they get their resin? Where do they get the tin for the little contacts? And also think that SMEs, we do not purchase 100 million euros worth of chips every year. We purchase maybe 50 pieces, maybe 100 pieces. So what we can do is limited. So to be constructive, a risk-based effort would help. A tier one limited effort would help to enable me to sign papers, systems, and due diligence on things I really can control. And please do not overblow it. Keep it limited to the most important rights that I can really check, and do not mix it up with too many issues like the Paris Climate Treaty. When I read the interview of Commissioner Reinders about the Paris Climate Treaty and other things, no limitations on company size, no restriction to tier one supplies. This would end up in things which are so large that we cannot fulfill it. And I want to fulfill it because we want that change. So being constructive, as was said before, that's the issue, not blockade.
Thank you, Bertram. We have, yes, thank you. We have a question now for Lara from Yanni Krak. Lara, can you talk about how we have seen existing due diligence legislation, like in France, play out? Any lessons to be learned?
I think the existing legislation, be it in France or in the Netherlands or in the UK, or the proposal that's now is being talked about in Germany, I think those are all good steps. I think they're all steps in the right direction. But I think the limitations with them are that they tend to only focus on one issue. So in my own country, the Netherlands, for instance, it's a law that is about child labor and avoiding child labor. In France, there is a law, but it is limited to the largest companies and not to the smaller ones. And so most of them, I think, are either issue-based or size-based. And I think that what we're doing here is something horizontal, something broad that includes many companies and that asks them to scan their entire value chains. And so it is novel in that way. So I would say that the lessons learned from that, insofar as we can tell, because some of these pieces are new, but is that they don't succeed in bringing about the change that we are all after, and that they are still they are, I wouldn't say they are toothless, but that they don't go far enough for us to achieve where we want to go.
Thank you, Lara. I hear that Ben also has a reaction to this question. So Ben?
No, it was a reaction to Bertram on indeed limiting the liability. And I think that's also maybe useful to clarify that the proposal by Ms. Walters and the Parliament as a whole actually limited civil liability to there where harm was caused or contributed. And the contribution scenarios, of course, where it gets a bit larger than what you traditionally think as causing. But contribution is not necessarily a light balance either. The OECD even clarifies that that's not something that needs to be a significant contribution. So given that the liability is limited to the harm caused or contributed, you do automatically already in the proposal have quite a limited amount of cases that of course are subject to that liability regime there where it's caused and contributed. The administrative enforcement, of course, ideally should go further to also look at there where there's a failure to do due diligence as a whole. But on the harm-based civil liability, I think it's already quite limited.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, please.
Key problem of the text which is now in the Parliament, and that is that the definitions of cause, contribute, and being directly linked to from the OECD guidelines, which were very precise, they are not respected in the Parliament's proposal. You mentioned that there is only responsibility for causing or contributing, that is in Article 19. The problem is that in Article 1, there is given a kind of definition of contribute, and in this contributing, it is included acts of others and acts as a consequence of being directly linked to. So it is precisely this blurring of definitions from the OECD guidelines in this document which create a big problem. If the exact definition of the OECD would be respected, a lot of problems would be avoided. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinan. We have a question to Lucrezia now from Catarina Vieira. How is DG Just working with DG Enf, which is also proposing due diligence in deforestation specifically? So how is this cooperation going?
Cooperation is going very well, and the Commission, as such, will make sure that all the initiatives that we will put forward will be very well coordinated and consistent among themselves. Just to clarify, the way in which we see at our proposal on due diligence is to look at it as a horizontal framework that will apply to all the sectors, and that will set the basic framework for all the companies that are active in all these sectors. This does not preclude then the possibility for the Commission to adopt other initiatives that are sector specific, like the one for deforestation, and that will apply to companies active in a certain sector in relation to certain risks and to certain products. There can be also other initiatives that can be of a legislative or non-legislative nature that can complete our initiative in the sense of setting out possibilities for companies to do more and to do also more specific, to carry out also more specific commitments. But the overall, what we are very attentive at is that the overall intervention stays coherent and consistent, and is very well coordinated also on technical level.
Thank you, Lucrezia. Laura, question for you on the timing, and I think Winant mentioned this in his opening statement, the timing of this legislation. As we know, it's due out, it's due to be proposed, sorry, in the second quarter of this year. Right now, we all know that almost all European companies, big, mid-sized, small, are struggling to deal with or even are struggling to survive this terrible COVID-19 pandemic. Do you worry that this additional and, as has been suggested, not insignificant bureaucratic burden might be the final nail in the coffin for some companies who are simply not able to comply?
I think we all worry about our companies, and I think we all worry about the health of our economy, and I think we all worry about the businesses that are struggling during COVID. I think that the timing of this won't mean that the two will coincide completely, because there is some way to go before we have legislation on this, of course. But equally, I don't think that the crisis is reason for us not to do anything. If anything, there is a strong link between the crisis and these value chains. I think the first reason that we have a crisis like this, if you zoom out, is that we have disturbed ecosystems all around the world that make it easier for viruses to jump from animals to people, and that is because we have cities that are growing and ecosystems being destroyed to make room for people. So I think that there's an intrinsic link already that we shouldn't forget. Practically speaking, I think the COVID crisis also means that many companies will be looking at their supply chains and scanning them for vulnerabilities. And I think they will be looking at, are we overly dependent on a certain source or a certain country? Are there things that we could be doing differently so that in a next crisis, we might not have the ruptures that we have seen now in the supply chains that have, that have caused economic losses as well. And I think there, for instance, if you look at medical supplies, if you look at simple things like mouth masks, I think that these very complex global value chains have shown that, there's vulnerabilities that you could avoid by bringing some of these parts of the business home, or perhaps not always depending on just-in-time management through the very most vulnerable countries. So I don't think that COVID is a reason not for us to do it. I'm not naive about what our businesses are going through at the moment, but I think that all of these things interact, and I think there is very good reason to be doing this and to be starting on this right now.
Okay. Bertram, let me come back to you about what you are currently doing to ensure that supply chains adhere to the highest possible ethical and environmental standards. Now, this could be described, I guess, as self-regulation. I'd like to hear what Tim and Ben think about self-regulation. Civil society is typically not in favor of it. But Bertram, do you think what you're currently doing and what your members are doing is okay? Is self-regulation working in this case?
There are hard and soft factors. First of all, again, we are not selling consumer goods. We are not selling a cheap T-shirt. We purchase all over the world in our distributed value chains highly complicated parts and components. Thus, we have value chains which are international, where we have high wages and higher labor costs, and we are not having these free market or these international value chains because we just want to, or because it's the cheapest. Sometimes it's local content demand. Sometimes it's proximity to our customers, where they demand that we are in our factories close to them. And it's the market in terms of pricing of goods. We will not see a return of the whole value chain only in Europe. So what we do in my company, for example, we have code of conducts, first of all, which we check. This is a hard factor. We have also as a hard factor, this code of conduct is a part of my supply contracts. When I purchase, I make them a part of my supply chain. So they are mandatory for my suppliers. And then there are soft factors. For example, if you visit a company, I will take care that, of course, you have the vision, you see what's happening in the company, you see whether the environment is okay, but that's only a one-day impression. You see also, does the owner of the company know his employees? Stuff like these are soft factors. I think a risk-based attempt would be enough. I think I do not think that we have big holes in the supply chain as far as I can see it. I repeat that. I would like the EU help me, maybe in whitelisting, as I said before. Could we have whitelists like the EU itself, maybe Canada, maybe New Zealand, where we do not have risk countries, to keep down the bureaucracy and help me in not making me drill down the whole chains.
So thanks, Bertram. Tim, is this risk-based approach enough? Could self-regulation work here?
Well, I mean, the whole rationale for the proposal is that the self-regulatory voluntary approach hasn't worked, and that's why we're here. So, I don't think, I think everybody accepts that there's real limitations to leaving companies to do their own thing, and we need to move towards something more mandatory. Just on this, if I can just pick up on a few things then that have been said. So one is on this proposal of a white list, and can we sort of say it's fine to source anything from, say, Europe or Canada or New Zealand, as was just suggested. I mean, in our experience, there are endemic human rights violations and ecological degradation here in Europe and every other rich country as well. So I don't think that you can have sort of blanket green light, applying to whole countries. I don't think that works. We've documented lots of cases with human rights violations in the agriculture sector here in Europe, for example, and the same would be the case of almost every country on earth. So I don't think it's about a country-based list. And I think the importance here is to go beyond those kind of quite crude measures to really get a sense of, in the particular supply chain, in the particular context of your suppliers, could there be risks? And, that it's about getting to know those suppliers rather than sort of using these quite crude indicators based on, a country's GDP or gross or GDP per capita or something. So that would be my reflection there. And just on some of the other points that we've heard, this idea to just limit to tier 1, I think that would be pointless, genuinely. For everything that we know about human rights and environmental risk in supply chains is that overwhelmingly this is occurring deep down in supply chains. It's not at the tier 1 level. If it was at the tier 1 level, it would be a lot easier to address, of course, but it's just unfortunate that that's not where the risks are. So if we were to just limit it to tier 1, we may as well not bother. But I think what I would say is that it's much better that a company, an SME, for example, or any other company, looks deep into one or two or a small number of supply chains where they do have greater leverage, where they identify risks, but where they also have a greater leverage over those sub-suppliers because of the orders that they are buying of that particular material, or for whatever other reason. It would be better to look deeply into a smaller number of supply chains than look at everything just at tier 1 level. And I think that's really what the legislation is trying to get at. It's getting you to really think about, to prioritize, not to try and do everything, but to prioritize where are the risks greatest and to really go deep in those few areas and try to do something where you can make a difference.
Ben, do you agree with that?
Overall, yes. And maybe also to pick in on that point versus voluntary initiatives versus legislation. I think what is important is that, again, we prevent those impacts. And until now, voluntary measures have not always, or as largely not delivered that. That's also what the DJ just study comes up. But what we believe is that once you put those initiatives in the shade of a legislation, those themselves might also become also much more effective. Because take, for example, a company that needs to deal with so many suppliers. I think the example has been raised a few times in the debate. Nothing says that in assessing the risk, for example, that a company needs to do that alone. They could also share those assessments with other companies who source from the same facilities, who are, if there is a legislation that applies to all companies, are also equally bound by the same obligations. So there is some economy of scale, and that can only help us in moving the preventative aspect forward. I'll give one example. Laura mentioned in the beginning the Rana Plaza accident. Well, in result of that, there's also a collaboration under the Bangladesh Accord that developed with 200 plus retailers, which actively identified fire and building safety risks and addressed them. So collaborations, if they're accountable and if they're results oriented, can deliver. So that's what, for us, that legislation would place neatly next to all those collaborative efforts.
Okay, thank you, Ben. I have a question for Winard first, and then I'd like Laura to respond to it as well. Do you think this legislation will put Europe and some European companies at a disadvantage? If such legislation is not imposed at a global level, will the Chinese and perhaps even a post-Brexit UK somehow benefit from these restrictions? In other words, how can we be sure that European companies are going to remain internationally competitive under this legislation? Winard?
Yeah, well, I think answering this question in general is very simple. Yes, this legislation leads to additional administrative burdens and sometimes to substantial cost. So it will have an influence on the international competitive position. There is no doubt. It is, of course, partly limited by the fact that companies from third countries active on the European market should also comply with this legislation. So that is a very important element which is in. But once again, the fact that there is a disadvantage, it very much depends on what is the final result of the legislation. Is it workable, yes or no? And there I would like to say once again, we are constructive. We want to improve the situation. We want to change the situation. And we should come to a result which substantially improves the situation and at the same time does not lead to unbearable administrative costs. That is the aim. Thank you.
Laura, what's your thought on international competitiveness of European companies?
I think, as Wienand said, what's important here is that this is not only an obligation for European companies, this is an obligation for anyone who wants to do business on our internal market. And I think we shouldn't be shy about leveraging that market and recognizing the value of it, not only the value of the market and our consumers as such, but also our global power in setting those standards. I think in GDPR, for instance, we have seen what the effect of that legislation can be if it's seen as a sort of gold standard or as measures that that can be copied elsewhere. And I don't want to be too, on the nose about this, but I think it was never the European way to beat our competitors by exploiting people and planet. Now, that's a bit of a caricature, perhaps. I mean, I'm not saying that all businesses do this, but I think there is a very good reason for us to do this now. And I think that it's important that we don't only oblige our own companies, but others too. But even zooming in on those others that would want to make use of our market to provide goods or services, I think there aren't that many that do business without any sort of intermediary or without a sort of office or head office even in Europe by way of example. Even Alibaba, I think, has a European headquarters in Liège, I believe. And that means that the competition aspect of it, absolutely, we need to be careful of that. We need to make sure that enforcement is good. I think there's also trade aspects here. We need to look at procurement. You know, it's a puzzle that is bigger than due diligence per se. But I think our aim should stay the same. And as I said, this is not something that only applies to European companies.
Thank you, Lara. We are now reaching the final part of our debate, so I'll just go through some of our most popular questions from the audience. And the first one is to Lucrezia. Apologies. The first one is actually to you, Lara, as well. So is there an intention to incentivize good behavior rather than proposing punitive provisions?
Would you like me to take that first, or Lucrezia?
Lara,
Lucrezia,
I think the question is for you.
To incentivize. If you're asking me, are there definitive carrots in this piece? Not as such. I think the carrot here, or the incentive for companies, is getting to know their supply chains better, which I think also can avoid damages, can avoid reputational risks, can avoid very costly court cases and so forth. I think there can also be an advantage in this, in that if you look at certain companies, they've really mastered also their strategies in terms of reaching consumers with their message of our products are ethical, or our products are sustainable. So I think there's a number of advantages along the way for companies for when companies do this. If you ask me, do you get a reward or a financial incentive? I think we've looked at financial assistance to SMEs, but incentives as such, or the whitelists, for instance, we were talking about for European companies themselves, no. But I think that the benefits for companies are in the medium, the long-term effects of the legislation here, and I think they can be considerable. If you look at, for instance, Tony Chocolonely is a Dutch chocolate make. It's made it, its unique selling point that it sells chocolate that is slave-free. So I think that it's been demonstrated that this can be done. It doesn't have to be a disadvantage. Needless to say, we need to get the legislation right in order for that to happen.
Thank you, Lara. We have a final question for Bertram, and a member of our audience says that risk-based due diligence seems fair and reasonable. What would businesses propose instead?
I think it is fair. As I said before, I think it would be fair and reasonable if it consists of things I can really control and check. And I often think there's a little misconception here of how we work, because I heard several times you should get to know your supply chain better. We are not chocolate producers. We have highly complicated, highly added value goods, which we sell to B2B customers. So keeping with the questions, yes, if it's limited, like a code of conduct to things I can really check, yes. If I can handle that. I like the idea of prioritization, as was said before. Not everything, maybe a few things and drill down, but that's not as I see the legislation proposal right now. So risk-based is okay, as long as I will be able to handle it.
Thank you, Bertram. Yes, Lara, go ahead, please.
No, I think that Bertram was asking for things that he can really practically do or check. But I think that what we're asking is practical. I wouldn't pretend we have put in all the details for that yet, but we are practical in that we're saying we want a company to make a risk assessment, and so to look at what risks would be most salient, and then, as Tim said, drill down on the ones it believes are most salient to its particular business. We're asking you to map your value chain and zoom in on the places or the sectors that might be more risky. We're asking you to make a prioritization strategy and to match your business strategy with what you're doing on due diligence, so that this doesn't end up in a sort of CSR silo somewhere else in the company. I think all of those things are practical things that can be done. And I think that those are things that can be asked of you regardless of how much control you have over that supply chain, because if there is limited control, then that is exactly what should be mentioned and what should be explained in that strategy that we're asking for.
Bertram, you have 30 seconds maximum to reply to that.
I would like to offer what we do with the German government as well on a European level, an industry dialogue on the issues of the mechanical engineering here to make it feasible. We are open to discussions. We want to go the way, but we want to keep it feasible for our SME companies. That was 20 seconds, was it? So
Very
offer
good.
of dialogue.
Thank you. Well, we're sadly out of time now. I would like to thank all of our panelists for their excellent contributions today. Thank you also to our online audience for their questions and to VDMA for supporting today's debate. At Euractiv, we will follow the vote in Parliament tomorrow and continue to report on this very important legislation. But in the meantime, please feel free to continue the conversation on EA Debates, #EA Debates. Euractiv will be back tomorrow at 3:30 with our next virtual conference on data privacy. But enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.